Just recently, you probably saw the headlines screaming about this massive takedown happened to the digital underground.
Yeah.
And this wasn't, some small-scale bust.
Yeah.
It was this highly coordinated international operation, really striking at the heart of, well, one of the most prolific hubs for illicit trade online.
That's exactly right. We're talking about the complete dismantlement of Archetyp Market. And law enforcement agencies, Europol included, they described it as dealing a really severe blow to drug trafficking operations online. It's a fascinating case study, actually, not just because of the technical challenge, operating or disrupting these hidden platforms, but also it shows this persistent, evolving game of cat and mouse between the criminals using cutting-edge tech and the global efforts trying to stop them.
And that intricate dance, that's exactly what we're diving deep into today.
Yeah.
Our mission really is to pull back the curtain on Archetyp Market. What was it? How did it get so big, so prominent in the shadows of the internet? What about the meticulous details of the international operation that brought it all tumbling down?
Yeah, the nuts and bolts.
And crucially, what does this one event tell us about the bigger picture? The broader landscape of online illicit trade and this relentless global pursuit to combat it. Because this isn't just about understanding one criminal marketplace.
No, it's more than that.
It's about understanding a whole hidden digital world.
Yeah.
And how its activities can, maybe unexpectedly, connect to risks that might be closer to you than you think.
Absolutely. I mean, looking at operations like this one, it just throws into sharp relief how serious organized crime has fully embraced the digital age. They've adapted.
Completely.
And in turn, you see how law enforcement is having to fundamentally change its strategies just to, well, keep pace. So this deep dive, we've structured it to give you not just the headlines, but the essential context, the insights drawn from all the detailed information we have about this event and its wider implications.
And we're actually able to bring you this deep dive today thanks to Stonefly.
Ah, yes.
Stonefly is a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. And look, in a world where digital assets are constantly under threat, security, resilience, they're just paramount.
Couldn't agree more.
So if you're looking for secure, maybe even ransomware-proof storage solutions, Stonefly specializes in providing air-gapped and immutable storage options. Really robust stuff.
That's key, the immutability.
It is. To learn more about how they can help protect your critical data, you can contact them directly. The email is sales@stonefly.com, and you can schedule a demo there. They really understand the importance of safeguarding your digital environment.
Okay, good stuff. So, before we jump into the takedown itself, let's really establish what Archetyp Market was, how did it function. People hear darknet market, but Archetyp, it had specific characteristics that made it kind of unique, didn't it?
Right, let's unpack that. Archetyp Market first popped up May 2020. And right from the get-go, it wasn't trying to be just another marketplace clone. It carved out a very particular niche, a specific technical approach.
How so?
Its operational network, it existed exclusively on the Tor network. That means, you couldn't just open your regular browser, Chrome or Firefox, and type in an address.
No way.
To even reach Archetyp, you needed a specialized browser, like the Tor browser itself, which is designed specifically to access these hidden onion services and anonymize your internet traffic.
Okay, so that decision right there, that signals a clear intent, right, towards anonymity, attracting a user base that's either already familiar with this stuff or, well, willing to engage with those hidden layers of the internet.
Definitely.
And they doubled down on that privacy aspect by being super selective about the currency they used. Transactions on Archetyp, they were conducted exclusively using Monero.
Ah, Monero. Okay, that's the cryptocurrency that's built with privacy features baked right in, isn't it? Unlike Bitcoin, where, the transactions are on a public ledger and theoretically traceable with enough effort and data analysis.
Right, potentially traceable. But Monero is designed from the ground up to obscure the sender, the receiver, and the transaction amounts. It does it by default.
So by mandating Monero, Archetyp added this significant layer of difficulty for anyone trying to follow the money. Law enforcement, for instance.
Precisely. It offered a much higher degree of obfuscation compared to other markets that might primarily use Bitcoin, maybe with mixers, but still, Monero was a step beyond.
Okay.
And then there was the product focus. Some darknet markets are like these illicit Walmarts, right? Selling everything from drugs to stolen data, weapons, you name it.
Yeah, the whole gamut.
But Archetype had a singular focus. It only accepted drug-related listings, nothing else.
So a dedicated marketplace just for drugs, operating deep within the Tor network, using a highly private cryptocurrency. It really sounds like a platform built by and for people deeply embedded in that world, or at least wanting maximum privacy for their drug transactions.
That's the picture it paints.
And I understand there's kind of a surprising story about the person allegedly behind it all.
Yeah, it's a fascinating, almost contradictory narrative that came out. The person alleged to be the main operator, known by the pseudonym ASNT.
ASNT, okay.
Reportedly gave an interview at some point where they discussed their, let's say, stated motivations. They described having a really challenging upbringing, deprived area, early exposure to drugs. The story goes that a significant turning point came after they tried LSD at age 20. Apparently, this prompted a period of intense reflection on their life, focusing particularly on, alcohol abuse and antisocial behavior they'd been involved in.
Wow. That kind of personal history and reflection seems really at odds with, running a massive, dangerous online drug market. What was the supposed goal then, the philosophy driving them after that experiment?
Impressed by the libertarian philosophy that underpinned the original Silk Road.
Ah, the infamous Silk Road.
Yeah, the pioneering darknet market shut down years ago. They apparently felt that many of the markets that came after Silk Road had become purely profit-driven, just businesses, losing that initial ideological stance.
Okay.
So their stated aim was to create a market that was less focused on just maximizing profit and more about supporting the European drug scenes, supposedly, even going so far as advocating for drug liberalization policies.
That's quite the juxtaposition. Claiming this philosophical bent towards liberalization while actively facilitating the illegal, often very dangerous, trade of substances on a massive scale. How did that supposed ideal actually manifest in the reality of Archetyp's operations?
Well, the reality, as you might expect, is starkly different from that stated philosophy. Archetype did become a huge, large-scale illicit drug market.
Right.
We know now from the investigation it processed hundreds of millions of euros in transactions. So while the administrator might have claimed a desire to support a scene or advocate liberalization,
The practical outcome was very different.
the practical, undeniable outcome was the operation of a significant platform for illegal, harmful trade. And this included, crucially, facilitating the sale of highly dangerous synthetic opioids like fentanyl.
Which directly contradicts any notion of promoting safety or community well-being.
Absolutely. It just blows that whole narrative out of the water. It really highlights the disconnect you sometimes see between the rhetoric used in these communities and the severe criminal consequences, and frankly, the real-world harm facilitated by their actions.
Okay, so it launched with this specific tech stack, this claimed philosophy back in 2020. How did it manage to grow from just being a new market to arguably the most significant player in the dark web drug trade by the time it was taken down in 2025?
Its growth wasn't overnight, but it was definitely steady, and you could say strategic. There were early signs of its growing popularity visible in research. For instance, there were findings presented at the May 2023 IEE conference. They used these pretty sophisticated algorithms to estimate the popularity of different onion services on the Tor network. And their findings indicated Archetype's rapid ascent. After the researchers managed to filter out all the noise, the numerous phishing sites, scam sites that mimic legitimate markets.
Which there are tons of, right?
Oh, loads. But once they filtered those out, Archetype was identified as the most popular genuine onion service website accessible on Tor at that time.
The most popular genuine site on the entire Tor network. That really underscores its dominance in that specific hidden space.
It really does. And Archetype also significantly benefited from something inherent to the darknet market ecosystem, its instability.
How so?
Well, these platforms, they're under constant threat, right? Not just from law enforcement, but also from things like exit scams where the admins just steal all the users' crypto funds and disappear.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
Happens all the time. Or internal disputes, technical failures. So when other markets faced issues or were taken down, the users and the vendors, they didn't just stop trading. They migrated. They moved to platforms that were established and seemed stable at the time.
So Archetype basically became a beneficiary of its competitors' failures.
Yeah.
Like picking up the pieces.
Exactly. There was a study, I think it was February 2024, that provided really clear evidence of this migration effect. It showed a large chunk of users from Flugsvamp, which was a popular Swedish darknet market, moved over to Archetype after Flugsvamp had these major security vulnerabilities and started facing allegations of fraud from its own users.
Okay, so that's one example. But this wasn't the only time that happened, was it?
Yeah.
It sounds like it became a pattern.
It was a consistent pattern. There was research conducted by the National Drug and Alcohol Research Center at the University of New South Wales. They were systematically tracking activity across various darknet markets over time. And their data from May 2024 confirmed Archetype's leading position. It was the largest among the 11 darknet markets they were monitoring then, based purely on the number of drug listings.
How many listings are we talking?
They recorded an average of 8,607 listings on Archetype just in May 2024. But what's really telling is how quickly it got to that top spot. Because just a few months earlier, January 2024, Archetype was ranked fourth.
Fourth to first in just a few months. What happened to the three markets that were ahead of it back in January?
Yeah, it's quite the jump. The markets that were ranked higher than Archetype in January, Incognito, Bohemia, and Nemesis, all of them ceased operations before that May data point.
All three. Wow. How?
Well, Incognito apparently faced an exit scam. Bohemia reportedly closed down due to law enforcement pressure. And Nemesis also shut down amidst various rumors. So this wave of closures basically created a vacuum.
An Archetype was there to fill it.
Exactly. It was clearly positioned to absorb all that displaced traffic, consolidating its user base, its vendor base, and just surging to the #1 spot in terms of listing volume.
So by the time the big coordinated law enforcement action happened, Archetype had really become the go-to platform for a huge number of people involved in the digital drug trade. What was its actual scale at the moment of the takedown? This was June 2025, right?
Yeah, June 2025. And at the time of its seizure, Archetype was operating at a truly massive scale for this type of platform. It had amassed over 600,000 registered users.
600,000. Just
Yep.
think about that number for a second. Individuals operating within this hidden network specifically for illicit transactions.
It's staggering. And it also hosted around 3,200 registered vendors, the sellers listing the drugs. Across all those vendors, there were over 17,000 individual drug listings available on the platform at that moment.
600,000 users, 3,200 vendors, 17,000 listings. That's a significant digital economy built entirely on illegal goods. What were the main types of drugs being traded?
Well, the platform facilitated the sale of a really wide array of substances that you commonly find on these markets. Things like cocaine, various types of amphetamines, MDMA, ecstasy, and synthetic opioids.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier, and this is critically important to keep highlighting, Archetype was specifically identified as one of the few major darknet platforms that explicitly allowed the sale of fentanyl.
Allowing fentanyl sales? I mean, that's just incredibly reckless and dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a substance linked to just a devastating number of overdose deaths globally.
Absolutely devastating.
That decision alone, it just starkly contradicts any pretense of having some kind of philosophical or harm reduction approach.
Okay.
It totally exposes the true criminal nature and the potential for immense harm that this market facilitated.
Couldn't agree more. It essentially became a significant node in the distribution network for incredibly potent, highly addictive, and potentially lethal substances, reaching hundreds of thousands of users. A really dangerous operation.
So, okay, you have this enormous, entrenched, drug-focused market operating for years, strategically using anonymity tools, benefiting from the failures of its rivals, basically becoming the biggest player. Naturally, this level of activity, it's going to draw the attention of law enforcement agencies around the world. Which brings us to the operation that finally dismantled it. Operation Deep Sentinel. When exactly did this takedown happen?
The coordinated seizure itself took place in June 2025, and the overall law enforcement effort was given that name, Operation Deep Sentinel.
Operation Deep Sentinel. Sounds pretty focused, like uncovering secrets or hidden threats. Was this the work of just one country, or was it something much larger, more complex?
Oh, this was a prime example of multinational law enforcement cooperation on a really massive scale. The operation was a deeply coordinated effort involving authorities from several European countries. You had Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Romania, and Sweden all playing key roles.
Okay, multiple European nations.
And these national efforts were significantly supported and coordinated by key pan-European bodies like Europol, the EU's law enforcement agency, and Eurojust, which facilitates judicial cooperation. Plus, they also received assistance from the United States.
Wow, that level of international effort. Multiple countries, major agencies like Europol and Eurojust, help from the U.S. It really suggests the target was considered high value, and the investigation must have been incredibly complex.
Absolutely.
How large was the actual operational force involved in the takedown phase itself?
They mobilized around 300 officers from all participating countries for what they called the Coordinated Action Week.
300 officers.
Yeah. This intensive period, focusing the actual takedown efforts, happened between June 11th and 13th, 2025. And the objective was broad and ambitious. They weren't just aiming to, shut down the website remotely.
Right.
They specifically targeted both the technical infrastructure and the key individuals behind the platform. That means everyone from the administrators right down to the platform's top-selling vendors.
Orchestrating 300 officers across multiple borders for a single, synchronized action targeting something on the dark web. That must require just immense preparatory work. What were the key execution details? How did they actually pull it off?
Well, according to Europol's statements on this, the takedown was really the culmination of years of incredibly intensive investigative work. This wasn't a quick win by any stretch.
Yeah.
It involved painstakingly mapping out the platform's sophisticated and deliberately obscured technical architecture. Just understanding how it was hosted, how it operated. Investigators also worked tirelessly to identify the real-world individuals hiding behind those online pseudonyms.
Like ASNT.
Like ASNT, exactly. And that involved meticulously tracing these complex cryptocurrency financial flows, often across multiple platforms and mixers, and analyzing just vast amounts of digital forensic evidence gathered over a long period.
Years spent just trying to understand the technical underpinnings and track down the people and the money involved. That's dedication.
It really is. All that detailed groundwork eventually led to this Coordinated Action Week, which, as I said, was planned and executed under the central coordination hubs of Eurojust and Europol.
And the critical step in the takedown itself.
The critical step was identifying and then locating the server infrastructure that actually hosted the Archetyp Market's data and operations. These servers were ultimately traced to a data center located in the Netherlands.
Oh, okay. In the Netherlands.
And that's where the physical seizure took place.
So they didn't just disrupt it remotely, they physically went in and took control of the hardware itself.
That's correct. It was a physical seizure of the server infrastructure. Once the authorities had control of those servers, the Archetyp website itself, both the hidden onion address on the Tor network and any associated ClearNet sites or portals they might have had, was replaced.
Replaced with what?
Instead of the usual market interface, visitors were met with this prominent seizure banner. And this banner linked to a specific website created just for Operation Deep Sentinel. It even featured a video message explicitly addressed to the underground economy.
A video message? Seriously?
Yeah, effectively serving as a very public declaration that Archetyp was now under law enforcement control. A bit of psychological warfare, perhaps?
A video message to the digital criminal world. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty bold statement. Okay, so after years of investigation and this huge coordinated action, what were the tangible results? What came out of Operation Deep Sentinel in terms of arrests and asset seizures?
Well, the most significant result was the arrest of the suspected primary administrator. Remember ASNT?
Yeah, the alleged founder with the backstory.
Right. A 30-year-old German national was apprehended on June 11th, right at the start of the action week. He was arrested in Barcelona, Spain. This individual is accused of being the main operator, the one using that pseudonym ASNT, and the one who reportedly gave that interview about the market's supposed philosophy.
So the alleged founder, arrested in Spain, far from the Netherlands where the servers were seized, were there related investigations or actions linked to him elsewhere?
Yes. Alongside the arrest in Spain, authorities conducted property searches believed to be connected to this suspected administrator. These searches happened in Hanover, Germany, and also in Bucharest, Romania.
Germany and Romania, too. Okay.
Which suggests his network or activities weren't confined to one place, right? Potentially covering different aspects of managing this distributed criminal operation across borders.
And the operation didn't just stop at the alleged head of the organization, did it?
Not at all. The coordinated action specifically targeted not only the admin, but also other key figures who were essential to the market's day-to-day operation and, importantly, its profitability.
Like who?
This included at least one moderator, someone who helped manage the platform, deal with disputes, etc., and also 6 of the top-selling vendors, the individuals responsible for a really significant volume of the illicit trade flowing through Archetyp.
Okay, so the big sellers. Where were actions taken against them?
Actions against these individuals took place primarily in Germany and Sweden. Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, the BKA, they confirmed that the measures taken in Germany and Sweden involved arrests. They specifically mention 7 individuals were arrested in Sweden alone in connection with this operation.
So if you count the admin arrested in Spain, that's at least 8 major arrests directly related to operating or profiting heavily from the market.
That's right. And on top of those targeted arrests, the operation also included searches at a total of 20 additional properties across the participating countries.
20 more searches.
Yeah. These searches were mainly focused on other moderators and other vendors associated with Archetyp, aiming to gather more evidence, maybe identify further suspects, and really dismantle the network supporting the market.
Okay, beyond the people arrested, what about the financial side? The physical assets seized during this whole operation?
This is where the sheer scale of the illicit activity becomes, well, just astonishingly clear. Authorities seized substantial assets during Operation Deep Sentinel. The total value reported was approximately 7.8 million.
7.8 million euros. That's equivalent to, what, about 9 million USD at the time?
Roughly, yeah, around $9 million.
That's a huge amount. That must be from multiple individuals, right?
Yeah.
Including the admin.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, and it really underscores the profitability for the top sellers on these platforms. Authorities specifically stated that the 7.8 million in assets was seized from one of Archetyp's biggest vendors alone.
Wait, seriously? That entire 7.8 million from just one vendor?
From just one of the top vendors. That figure doesn't even encompass all the money and assets seized across the entire operation from everyone else. It just vividly illustrates the potential for vast illegal wealth accumulation that these darknet markets facilitate for their top participants.
That's incredible. Just mind-boggling. What else did they seize besides cash or crypto assets?
Beyond the currency, authorities also seized a significant amount of digital hardware, which is crucial for follow-up investigations. They got 47 smartphones and 45 computers. Plus, they seized quantities of narcotics and other assets as well.
And those seized devices, the phones, the computers, they'll be absolutely crucial for digging deeper, won't they?
Yeah.
Potentially providing access to encrypted communications, transaction records, links to other individuals.
Oh, precisely. Analyzing the data on those devices will be key to uncovering more details about how the market operated, identifying more users and vendors, and potentially linking this activity to wider criminal networks. It's a treasure trove of potential evidence.
Okay, so stepping back from the individual seizures and arrests, what's the overall impact here, the metrics for this takedown? How much trade volume did Archetyp actually handle during its lifetime, and what's the significance of shutting down a platform of this size?
Well, the estimated total trade volume processed through the Archetyp platform from its launch in 2020 until its seizure in June 2025 exceeded 250 million.
€250 million.
Yep, which is approximately $289 to $290 million USD.
Over $250 million in illicit transactions flowing through just one single darknet market. That is a truly staggering amount of criminal activity being channeled through this hidden digital space.
It really is. And Europol strongly emphasized the profound significance of disrupting this flow. They stated that the operation dealt a severe blow to major drug traffickers operating online. It effectively cut off a critical supply line, particularly, they noted, for highly dangerous substances like fentanyl, which we know is explicitly allowed on the platform.
Right.
Jean-Philippe Lecouf, he's Europol's Deputy Executive Director of Operations, delivered a pretty pointed message about this. He said the operation sent a clear signal. No safe haven for those who profit from harm.
No safe haven.
Yeah.
That phrase really captures the resolve, doesn't it, behind these large-scale international efforts. And as you mentioned earlier, this takedown isn't happening in a vacuum. It kind of fits into this broader pattern of operations targeting major dark web markets.
Exactly. Europol themselves highlighted that Operation Deep Sentinel followed on from and built upon the successes of previous major takedowns of other significant dark web markets. They mentioned operations targeting platforms like Kingdom Markets, Incognito, Nemesis, Bohemia, and Torador.
So it's a strategy.
It demonstrates a sustained ongoing strategy by international law enforcement. They're trying to systematically dismantle these large digital criminal infrastructures rather than just treating each market as an isolated incident.
It really paints a picture of this constantly evolving landscape, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where organized crime is migrating online, adapting, and law enforcement is having to adapt too, chasing them into the digital realm. This Archetyp takedown is just a really stark example of that larger trend.
Absolutely.
So let's zoom out now. Let's discuss what Archetype tells us about the broader digital landscape of illicit trade, which obviously extends far beyond just this one market.
Yeah, the fundamental shift is just undeniable at this point. The internet has profoundly transformed black markets globally. Transactions that once relied heavily on, physical proximity, covert meetings, maybe established street networks.
Right, the old ways.
They're increasingly being conducted and facilitated through sophisticated digital marketplaces and all sorts of online channels.
So is it fair to say that almost all serious crime now leaves some kind of digital trail or has a digital component?
That's pretty much Europol's assessment. They contend that nearly all forms of serious and organized crime activities now have a significant digital footprint, whether that's in the planning stages, communication between criminals, the financial transfers, or the actual sale and distribution of illicit goods and services online.
And why the shift online? What are the main drivers?
Criminals are choosing the online domain because it offers distinct advantages. One is increased efficiency. They can reach a far wider customer base much more quickly and with less logistical overhead than traditional methods.
Thanks, Saz.
And the other big one is enhanced anonymity. The layers provided by things like Tor and crypto offer a crucial layer of protection compared to face-to-face dealings, making identification and prosecution harder.
Do we have any estimates on the overall scale of criminal activity specifically happening on the dark web? Like, how big is this hidden economy?
There are various estimates out there, and pinning down precise numbers is obviously hard because it's designed to be hidden, but they paint a picture of significant scale. As of 2025, researchers estimate there are maybe around 30,000 active websites operating on the dark web.
The 30,000 active sites.
Yeah. And critically, studies suggest that a substantial majority of these, somewhere between 56% and 60%, are involved in criminal activities.
Oh, over half.
And the financial volume is also substantial. Estimated daily revenue generated just from darknet markets alone is thought to be somewhere between US $5 million and US $7.5 million.
$5 to $7.5 million in criminal revenue every single day, just from the marketplaces. How do these sites even manage to process that kind of volume? You mentioned encryption and crypto, but structurally, how do they work?
Yeah, it's fascinating. They often mimic legitimate e-commerce platforms quite closely in their user interface and how they function.
Like Amazon or eBay, but for illegal stuff.
Pretty much. You'll find detailed product descriptions, often with images, vendor rating systems, customer reviews, all designed to build a level of trust, even though it's in an illicit context.
Right. The trust mechanisms.
But yes, their operation relies fundamentally on those anonymity layers. The Tor network, which Archetype used exclusively, encrypts traffic and bounces it through relays worldwide, making it incredibly difficult to trace the physical location of the servers or the users. And then the use of cryptocurrencies, especially privacy-focused ones like Monero, or even Bitcoin if it's used through tumblers or mixers, adds more layers of difficulty to financial tracing.
And what about the variety of goods being traded? Is it mostly drugs, like Archetype focused on?
Far from it, actually. While drugs are definitely a dominant category, the dark web is a marketplace for a really shocking variety of illicit goods and services.
Like what else?
Beyond narcotics, you can find listings for things like illegally traded wildlife, vast quantities of counterfeit items, luxury goods, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and perhaps most relevant to broader digital security concerns, stolen data.
Ah, the data breaches.
Massive databases of login credentials, personal identifying information, compromised credit card details, that's huge business. There are also extensive markets for hacking tools and software, malware, exploit kits, and concerningly, weapons.
Weapons on the dark web.
Yeah. Data from 2022, for instance, showed over 35,000 listings for weapons on darknet markets. And a concerning stat was that 60% of those listings were somehow linked to the United States.
Wow.
Financial fraud is another massive segment. It's estimated to account for over 34% of dark web activity. There were reports of over 100 million compromised credit card records being leaked or sold just in 2022 alone.
It sounds like the dark web is maybe just the tip of the iceberg, though. Isn't some of this activity also bleeding over onto the regular internet, the surface web that we all use every day?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. While the dark web provides the maximum level of technical anonymity, the surface web, including mainstream social media platforms, standard e-commerce sites like eBay or Alibaba, even encrypted messaging apps like Telegram or WhatsApp, is increasingly being leveraged for illicit trade.
Especially for certain types of crime.
Exactly. This seems particularly true for the drug trade to some extent, and also significantly for wildlife trafficking.
But why use the surface web if it's inherently Less anonymous than Tor. What's the trade-off?
It really comes down to ease of use and accessibility for both buyers and sellers. Many potential customers just aren't technically savvy enough to navigate the Tor network or deal with privacy-focused cryptocurrencies.
Lower barrier to entry.
Exactly. Using platforms they're already familiar with significantly lowers that barrier. And depending on the platform and how carefully it's used, using fake profiles, coded language, temporary accounts, it can still provide a surprising measure of anonymity, or at least make it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to sift the criminal activity out from the sheer volume of legitimate interactions happening on these massive global platforms.
Any specific examples?
Well, countries like Indonesia and China have been specifically identified as major hubs where wildlife trafficking, for instance, is extensively facilitated through standard e-commerce sites and social media groups.
Okay, now let's really focus back specifically on the drug trade, given Archetyp's nature. It is, you said, one of the most prominent and financially significant illicit markets operating in the digital space.
Without a doubt.
And we've seen evidence that the value of this online drug trade is actually growing significantly year over year.
That's correct. The data suggests that darknet marketplaces facilitated drug transactions worth over US $1.7 billion just in cryptocurrency in 2024 alone.
$1.7 billion.
Yeah. And what's particularly striking is that this figure represents year-on-year growth of over 20%. So this isn't a stagnant criminal activity. It's rapidly expanding its digital footprint and its financial volume.
Is there a connection between this digital growth in the drug trade and the broader global trends we're seeing in organized crime related to drugs offline?
There appears to be a very strong correlation, yeah. This digital expansion corresponds directly with systematic increases we're seeing in the criminal market scores for illicit drugs, as measured by the Global Organized Crime Index.
Remind us what that index measures.
It evaluates the scale and impact of various illicit economies worldwide. And the scores for all the major drug categories, heroin, cocaine, cannabis, and synthetic drugs, all showed a worsening trend globally between 2021 and 2023.
Worsening meaning the illicit markets are growing.
Exactly. Becoming more pervasive, more influential. And notably, every single continent saw an average increase in scores for at least 3 out of the 4 drug markets evaluated by the index. It indicates a really widespread escalation of these illicit drug economies worldwide.
So the online marketplaces aren't just replicating the existing street trade. They actually seem to be fueling its overall growth and reach on a global scale.
That's a key implication, yes. Furthermore, the Global Organized Crime Index identified something else interesting, a strong and statistically significant correlation specifically between the synthetic drugs trade and cyber-dependent crimes.
A specific link between synthetic drugs and cybercrime. That sounds counterintuitive, maybe. What does that connection suggest?
Well, the analysis suggests that the prevalence of online purchasing, particularly for synthetic drugs, which often require maybe a bit more technical sophistication to find and acquire online, compared to, say, cannabis.
Right, they're more niche sometimes.
Exactly. It implies the existence of a pretty well-established cyber environment among those involved in this trade. This environment includes familiarity with anonymity tools like Tor or VPNs, cryptocurrencies, navigating hidden forums, and so on.
Okay.
And this established cyber capability within the synthetic drug trade seems to create a heightened risk of engagement in other cyber-dependent crimes, things like hacking, data theft, financial fraud. It suggests this dangerous cross-pollination of skills and infrastructure between different types of online criminal activity.
It's like the digital tools and expertise developed for one illicit market can be easily repurposed or leveraged for another.
Yeah,
It's worrying.
very much so.
Beyond just making drugs more available to a wider audience, how else have these digital markets fundamentally changed the mechanics of the drug trade itself? How is buying and selling different online compared to traditional offline methods?
They've reshaped several key aspects. For one, online platforms often facilitate and even encourage bulk purchasing.
Buying in larger quantities.
Yeah. It's much simpler for a buyer to arrange a large, maybe even wholesale quantity transaction with a distant vendor through an online platform than it is to coordinate that kind of deal offline. Offline bulk deals are often more visible, carry higher risks of detection or violence for both parties involved.
Okay, so easier bulk buying. What else?
We're also seeing increased sophistication among the vendors themselves. Many of the larger online sellers operate much more like streamlined digital businesses now. They offer a wider variety of substances, perhaps better quality control or perceived quality control through reviews, and they often focus on higher value, potentially wholesale level transactions rather than just dealing in small retail sales.
So the market might be consolidating around these larger, more professional online vendors.
Data from the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, seems to support that trend. While the actual number of active darknet marketplaces has shown a tendency to fluctuate, sometimes falling after major takedowns,
Right.
the average transaction size on the remaining platforms seems to be rising. Their data from 2023 broke down sales categories. Large retail transactions defined as US $100 to $499 made up the biggest single share at about 37.8%.
It's okay, significant redeal.
But potential wholesale purchases, those over US $1,000, accounted for a very significant 31.9% of the value. This indicates that a substantial portion of the trade volume is shifting towards these larger scale deals conducted entirely online alongside the smaller retail transactions. Small retail was about 19%, and social supply around 11%.
Interesting breakdown. Did the global disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic have any noticeable impact on this shift toward online drug trade?
It certainly seems to have accelerated the move online across many sectors, right? And illicit trade was no exception. Lockdowns, reduced social contact, increased reliance on delivery services. All these factors likely pushed both traditional criminals and potentially new users towards exploring online platforms for buying and selling.
Makes sense.
However, trying to actually track user behavior in this space became even more challenging during that period, precisely because transactions were becoming more insular and anonymous, moving further away from potentially observable street-level interactions that police might monitor.
It sounds like moving online offers certain perceived benefits, mainly anonymity and convenience for both criminals and users, but it must introduce a whole new set of risks as well.
Oh, absolutely. For buyers, there's a significant risk of straightforward cyber fraud. You pay for something, you get counterfeit goods, or you get nothing at all. Or you get caught up in vendor disputes or exit scams.
Yeah, losing your money.
And then there are the immense health risks, particularly with unregulated substances purchased online. Especially synthetic drugs where dosage can be critical and the quality and purity are completely unknown and inconsistent. This poses huge dangers for both experienced users and particularly for unpracticed or new users who might not know what they're dealing with.
But despite those risks,
Despite those new risks, the perceived safety compared to traditional street dealing, the idea of avoiding potential physical violence, avoiding direct interaction with unknown criminals on the street, and maybe avoiding immediate police encounters, that perception of safety is a major draw. It seems to be attracting new users who might have been hesitant to engage in the more visible offline markets.
we talked about the specific drugs found on Archetyp. Does the type of drug being sold generally influence whether it's traded primarily on the dark web versus other online platforms like social media?
It appears to, yeah. While cannabis remains arguably the most commonly traded drug online overall, probably followed by synthetic drugs and cocaine, with opioids maybe a bit less prevalent online.
Right.
The choice of platform often seems to vary based on the specific substance and also the regional context, like local laws and social acceptance.
Yeah.
Synthetic drugs, for example, seem to have a higher propensity for being sold on dedicated darknet markets like Archetyp was, or maybe specialized online shops hidden away. Perhaps because they're more niche, require greater discretion, or target a more tech-savvy user base.
Okay. And things like cannabis or cocaine.
Cannabis and cocaine, particularly in regions where there's partial legalization or maybe higher social acceptability, might be more frequently traded through less hidden channels like encrypted messaging apps, closed social media groups, or even sometimes on surface web e-commerce sites using coded language.
And what about drugs like heroin or the heavily controlled prescription opioids?
Heroin and traditional opioids generally show a lower online presence compared to the others. This is likely because they are subject to extremely high levels of regulation and law enforcement focus globally. Any online activity related to them is exceptionally risky for both sellers and buyers.
So they stick to older methods.
It seems users and suppliers might rely more on established, trusted, often very localized offline networks for these particular substances. And, of course, underlying all of this, the platform choice for any given illicit substance also depends heavily on the general level of internet access and digital literacy within different geographical regions. You need the infrastructure and the know-how.
Are there particular geographical hotspots where this digital drug trade tends to originate from, or where consumption is most concentrated?
Yes, there are some clear geographical hubs identified in the research and by law enforcement. Most dark web drug shipments that have been traced seem to originate from a few key regions, primarily the United States, Northern and Western Europe, and Russia.
Okay, U.S., Europe, Russia as sources.
Right. And these same regions also tend to serve as the major consumer hubs for drugs purchased on the dark web. It aligns with what we discussed earlier about the Global Organized Crime Index scores for drug trade activity being notably high in North America, Northern Europe, and Western Europe.
Right, the scores match the activity.
Russia, in particular, has been identified as a really significant player in the space. They seem to have pioneered what's been described as a kind of unique digital drug trade model.
What's unique about the Russian model?
Instead of relying on mail delivery, which is common in the West, or face-to-face exchanges, their model leans heavily on anonymous online transactions, often on darknet platforms, using crypto combined with physical dead drops.
Dead drops? What's that?
It means the seller leaves the package of drugs in a pre-agreed hidden location under a specific rock, taped behind a sign buried somewhere, and the buyer then receives the location details, often GPS coordinates, digitally. They go and pick it up later without the two parties ever having to meet or interact directly.
Wow. That combination of digital anonymity for the transaction and then a physical dead drop for the pickup sounds incredibly difficult for law enforcement to intercept or investigate using traditional methods.
It does. It requires a very different policing approach than, say, busting street-level dealers or intercepting packages in the mail. And notably, Russia recorded an extremely high proportion of drug users, something like 85.7% back in 2022, reporting that they purchased their drugs via the darknet. And its 2023 index score for drug trafficking was correspondingly high at 5.75.
Okay, so that model is deeply entrenched there. Are other regions catching up or getting involved?
While the US, Europe, and Russia are still the major players, we are seeing emerging markets becoming increasingly involved. Countries like China, Vietnam, and even Venezuela are being noted as becoming more significant nodes in this global network. Not just for purchasing illicit substances online, but also in some cases for manufacturing certain drugs or sourcing the precursor chemicals that are then traded digitally. So it's a globalizing digital problem. Even with major operations like Deep Sentinel successfully taking down huge platforms like Archetyp, the overall digital illicit trade landscape seems incredibly resilient, adaptable, almost fluid. What does this ongoing challenge really mean for law enforcement and the broader fight against organized crime?
Yeah, resilient is definitely the word. It means acknowledging that while takedowns like the one against Archetyp are significant operational successes, they absolutely disrupt supply lines, they allow for gathering crucial intelligence, and they lead to the prosecution of key criminals.
Right, they're wins.
They're wins. But the market itself shows this remarkable resilience. When one major platform is removed, the vendors and the purchasers often just migrate relatively quickly to other existing platforms, or new ones pop up to fill the void. So the overall volume of digital illicit trade can, unfortunately, remain relatively consistent over the longer term.
The whack-a-mole effect people talk about.
Exactly. It's a constant battle, often described precisely as that whack-a-mole effect. So how are states and international agencies trying to respond to this constantly shifting target?
Well, states are actively working to respond, for sure. This involves things like implementing new legislation specifically designed to address cybercrime and online illicit activity. They're enhancing law enforcement measures, creating specialized digital units with the right skills and tools. And they're pushing for digital reforms, trying to make it harder for criminals to operate online anonymously, maybe through greater cooperation with tech companies, though that's always complex.
But it's not enough yet.
It's clear that countering this rapidly growing and constantly evolving threat requires continuous adaptation. Law enforcement needs to enhance its intelligence gathering capabilities, specifically tailored to the digital space. That means tracking user migration patterns between markets, analyzing blockchain data more effectively, developing new ways to harness emerging technologies like AI for investigative purposes.
It really sounds like a continuous technological arms race between the criminals finding new ways to hide and law enforcement finding new ways to track them.
It absolutely is. And it's also crucial to understand, as we touched on earlier, that the online drug trade doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not isolated.
Right, connections.
As a major criminal market operating online, it's deeply interconnected with other types of illicit activity, particularly cyber-dependent crimes like hacking and fraud and complex financial crimes involving cryptocurrency laundering. So effectively tackling the online drug trade often requires simultaneously addressing these intertwined criminal activities. You can't just focus on the drugs.
So it needs a holistic approach.
Exactly. It means combating this threat requires a multifaceted approach that goes way beyond just technical solutions or law enforcement busts. It demands greatly enhanced international cooperation, like we saw with Operation Deep Sentinel. It requires adjustments to policy and legal frameworks to keep pace with digital innovation. And frankly, it requires a much deeper, ongoing understanding of the constantly changing cyber landscape that criminals are exploiting.
Okay, that's the complex picture for governments and agencies operating at that high level. But let's bring it back down to the listener again. What does all of this deep dive into a darknet market takedown, understanding the broader digital illicit trade landscape, what does it mean for you, our listener, whether you're just, interested in this stuff, or maybe you're a business owner?
Yeah, that's a really important connection to make. It means recognizing that this underground activity, even though it's operating in these hidden corners of the internet, it's not entirely disconnected from your daily life or your work, especially if you interact with digital systems in any way.
And particularly for businesses.
Particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, SMBs. For them, there is an urgent and growing need to significantly strengthen their cybersecurity posture because they're increasingly targets.
I think a lot of SMB owners might still think, hackers are after the big corporations, the banks, the governments, not my small shop. Why are SMBs particularly vulnerable to risks that might stem from activity on the dark web?
Yeah, that's a common misconception, and unfortunately, it's a dangerous one. While large enterprises are definitely targets, SMBs are increasingly attractive to cybercriminals for a few key reasons. One, they often have weaker security frameworks compared to large companies with dedicated IT security teams.
Fewer resources.
Exactly. They typically have limited internal resources, time, money, expertise dedicated specifically to cybersecurity, meaning they can just be easier targets to breach. And critically, SMBs often serve as entry points into larger supply chains.
Ah, the supply chain attacks.
Right. Compromising a smaller business, a supplier, or a contractor can sometimes be the easiest path for a criminal group to gain access to the networks or the data of a much larger partner or client further up that chain, so they become stepping stones.
So what are the actual tangible risks of exposure from this kind of dark web activity for an average SMB? What could happen?
The risks of having your data compromised are very real and varied. If your employee login credentials, your sensitive customer data, your internal documents, maybe your intellectual property get exposed.
How would they get exposed?
Maybe through a phishing attack that succeeds because defenses are weak, or maybe a breach happens somewhere else entirely, like a third-party service you use, and that data gets aggregated and sold. Those details can very quickly end up being traded or sold on dark web marketplaces like Archetyp was, but for data.
And the consequences of that data ending up there.
The consequences are severe. It could be direct financial theft from compromised company or customer accounts. Immense reputational damage if customers find out their data was breached through you. Significant operational disruption if systems get locked down by ransomware or data is held hostage. And potentially huge legal and regulatory liability, fines, lawsuits, especially if sensitive customer data is breached.
And finding out might take time.
What's especially concerning is that these exposures, like stolen credentials being sold online, can often go completely unnoticed by the business for weeks, months, even longer. This gives threat actors ample opportunity to exploit that stolen information before anyone inside the company is even aware there's a problem.
Which really highlights that simply reacting after a breach has happened is often far too late. The damage is already done.
Exactly. That traditional reactive security model, fixing things only after something bad happens, it's just insufficient in today's threat landscape. Businesses, especially SMBs, who maybe have less of a financial buffer to absorb a hit, need to proactively defend themselves. They need to be actively seeking out and closing their vulnerabilities before criminals can find them and exploit them, possibly using information or tools sourced from places like dark web markets.
Okay, so being proactive is key. What are some practical, concrete steps that a business owner, even a small one with limited resources, can actually take based on what we've discussed today?
Based on the landscape we've outlined, a few key practical steps are really crucial. First, regularly performing vulnerability assessments and security gap analyses. You simply need to know where your weak points are. Is it your network configuration? Outdated software? Weak user access policies? You need to find them first.
Know thyself, digitally speaking.
Exactly. Second, actively using or subscribing to dark web monitoring services has become increasingly important, even for smaller businesses.
Mhm.
These tools can continuously scan known underground forums and marketplaces to detect if any of your company's login credentials, customer data domains, or other sensitive information appears there early on.
And early detection helps how?
Early detection allows for a rapid response. For instance, if employee emails and passwords show up, you can force password resets across your entire organization immediately before those exposed credentials can be used to actually breach your systems. It buys you critical time.
Makes sense. What else?
Third, if internal resources and expertise are genuinely limited, partnering with cybersecurity specialists or managed security service providers, MSSPs, who can provide tailored services scaled to your business size is a very smart investment. They can help implement stronger defenses, provide expert monitoring, and respond to incidents.
Okay, expert help.
And finally, don't overlook leveraging the numerous free cybersecurity resources available out there. Many governments like CISA in the US, NCSC in the UK, and various industry bodies offer excellent free frameworks, practical guidelines, and even employee security awareness training materials specifically designed to help smaller organizations build a solid foundational level of defense without breaking the bank.
So there are resources available even for smaller budgets. Beyond just the technical steps, are there regulatory aspects that businesses need to pay close attention to in this environment, especially regarding data protection?
Absolutely, and this is becoming increasingly important globally. Aligning your cybersecurity practices with the relevant regional and international regulatory frameworks isn't just about avoiding potentially hefty fines, although that's a big motivator. It's also crucial for building and maintaining trust with your customers and partners in a world where data breaches are unfortunately quite common.
Which regulations are key?
Well, it depends on where you operate and who your customers are, but major ones include GDPR in Europe, the NIS2 directive, which is expanding cybersecurity requirements for essential and important entities across the EU. And you have similar frameworks in other regions, like Australia's Privacy Act, their notifiable data breach scheme, and the Essential 8 security framework. Or look at the UAE's comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. All these impose specific requirements related to data protection, implementing security measures, and often mandatory reporting if a breach occurs.
So being compliant with these regulations is essentially a form of proactive defense in itself. It forces good practice.
Yes, in many ways it does. It enforces a more structured and accountable approach to security. Compliance often requires things like conducting regular security audits, maintaining detailed records of how you process and protect data, implementing specific technical and organizational security measures like encryption or access controls, and for some businesses, potentially appointing a dedicated data protection officer. Adhering to these frameworks helps ensure accountability and demonstrates a clear commitment to safeguarding sensitive information, the very information, as the Archetyp case vividly shows, that is constantly being targeted, stolen, and exploited in the digital underground.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into the takedown of Archetyp Market has really illuminated several critical aspects of our modern digital landscape, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've seen the immense scale and the technical sophistication of online illicit trade. We've seen the significant, successful efforts by international law enforcement in dismantling key platforms like Archetyp. But we've also seen the underlying persistent resilience and, frankly, frightening adaptability of the digital criminal underground.
Yeah, it forcefully brings home the point, I think, that these seemingly distant activities happening in the hidden layers of the internet can have very tangible consequences. They can pose very real risks to digital security and data integrity for individuals and businesses alike, even those who think they're not connected.
On the way forward.
Moving forward effectively demands not only continued sophisticated law enforcement efforts, but also, crucially, a much more widespread adoption of proactive digital defense strategies at all levels, individual, business, organizational, and just a collective, deeper understanding of this rapidly evolving cyber landscape we're all operating in.
So as law enforcement agencies continue to innovate, as they execute these major, complex international operations like Operation Deep Sentinel, successfully disrupting massive markets, arresting key figures, it leaves us with this fundamental, lingering question, doesn't it? How will the digital underground adapt and shift next in response to these pressures? Will the relentless pace of technological advancement provide criminals with even more sophisticated tools for anonymity, for obfuscation? Or will continuous innovation in areas like digital forensics, international intelligence sharing, maybe AI-driven analysis, will that finally manage to tip the scales decisively in favor of law enforcement and cybersecurity?
That really remains the central defining challenge, I think, of this ongoing digital conflict. Where does the balance lie and how does it shift?
A powerful thought to consider as we all navigate this space. And we want to remind you once more that this deep dive was brought to you by Stonefly.
Great sponsor.
Stonefly is a leader in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. In today's challenging digital environment, securing your data is just more critical than ever. So if you're looking for truly secure, maybe even ransomware-proof storage, be sure to check out Stonefly's air-gapped and immutable storage options. You can reach out to them directly at sales@stonefly.com to schedule your demo. They can really help ensure your critical digital assets are protected.
Thanks for joining us as we explored this pretty complex and, frankly, slightly scary topic today.
Yeah, absolutely. We really hope this deep dive provided you with some valuable insights into the significance of the Archetyp takedown, but also the broader implications for the digital world that, like it or not, we all inhabit.